Good morning, everyone. We'll call our meeting to order. First item we have is introduction of bills. Senator Fagg. Oh, you didn't? Okay. Oh, okay.
I had one this morning.
Okay, did anyone have any bills? Seeing none, we'll move on. First item on the agenda today is Secretary D'Angela Burns Wallace, Department of Administration. Welcome to committee, D'Angela.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, committee members. It's good to see you all. I haven't seen many of you as the session has started. I actually come to you this morning on behalf of the Office of Recovery at your request to provide an update on where the Spark process is. And so joining me this morning online is actually our Spark project director, John Paralisi. So what we have provided to you is just a kind of, I believe it's 2-page allocation tracker that lists the different dollars that have hit the discretionary fund to date to kind of just give you an update. And you can see we tried to break them out by Spark transactions and then the legislative directives, just to give you a sense of how these dollars have moved so far. But our Spark project director, John Paralisi, really has the bulk of this presentation so that he can walk you all through how the advisory committees are moving forward, how the next stage of this investment work is going to happen. And then both of us can stand for any questions that you all may have that we can try to answer. Mr. Chair, if you're okay, I would like to turn it over to John to walk you all through the advisory committee process.
John, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Hi. Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm once again John Paralisi. I was brought on board by the Spark Committee in December to lead the structuring and execution of the Spark process, particularly with regards to prioritization of future funds. And I can walk you through kind of a high-level overview of what we've structured and what we're getting underway with, even this week with the advisory panels. Okay, on slide 2 of the presentation, which hopefully everyone is seeing, we started this process really working off of what the Spark Committee had outlined in terms of guiding principles for how they wanted to proceed with the process and the types of outcomes they wanted to try and be able to achieve through it. So really, here's the list. And these were in place before I came on board. But it's really around prioritizing sustainable programs of investment. So catalytic investments, one-time use of funds, wherever possible, understanding the entire funding landscape so that we understand kind of where these funds could uniquely fit in, what's their sweet spot. Fostering long-term systemic impact for Kansans, so think strategically. It's been, a few people have said, I'd like to be able to stand back 10 years from now and look at the decisions and investments that were made with this and be able to say, I think that, feel good about the path that it put us on. Consider equitable opportunities and outcomes with regards to the decisions being made, ensuring the appropriate amount of flexibility with those strategies because things can change, and ensuring that results are measurable and transparent, both with regards to this process itself as well as coming out of the process with any decisions that have been made. So, and this was also set up when I come into the project. The decision had been made to do most of the work in terms of idea generation and prioritization through 4 advisory panels: economic, health and education, connectivity and efficiency and modernization, with that last one focusing mainly with regards to government operations and services. And I was brought on board as the project director on behalf of the Spark Executive Committee to help make sure that process is structured correctly for the guiding principles and flows correctly, and allows the Spark Executive Committee to be able to make fully informed decisions in a recommendation to the State Finance Council. On slide 4, this is the first slide where, as I came on board, working with the team, where we work through, given the guiding principles, here are the principles that we had for how we structured the process. So from a timeline perspective, the goal was to get to a final set of priorities from the Spark Committee late April, early May. And that's a fairly ambitious timeline, and we pressure tested it with various people along the way, including the panel chairs, with the feedback that we got was aggressive yet needed, and think it's manageable. In terms of opportunity evaluation, what we wanted to do was make sure that we were being broad in terms of the ideas that we were contemplating at the start, but also getting efficient fairly quickly as those ideas moved through the process, so that we placed most of our effort around detailing and prioritizing ideas with kind of the highest priority list of viable ideas. The other thing you'll see, as I shortly go into the timeline, leaving a lot of opportunity for iteration, both at the advisory panel level and at the Spark Committee level, as well as between them, so that this is something that each group really gets to work through themselves, rather than just getting asked to approve a set of recommendations that comes to it. What I'd heard a few times from the Spark Committee was, I want to be able to see enough and get involved enough so that I know that when I'm saying yes to something, I know what I'm saying no to at the same time. And we believe that the process that we created will allow that. Having a level of process consistency and transparency was something that we focused on, and providing the opportunity for expert input to be pulled in both at the advisory panel level and at the Spark Committee level as we continue to move through the process. And then making sure that we kind of supported this from a resource standpoint, because everyone who's involved, we appreciate their commitment and the fact that this is really a night job. And in some cases, they have several night jobs. And so we are really going to need to support this process pretty heavily in order to carry it out. So slide 5, and I'll admit up front, is a fairly messy, detailed slide around the end-to-end approval process, but I'll try and walk you through kind of the key pieces of it. So if you look at under advisory panels and meetings, basically the flow is that at the end of this week, today and tomorrow, we're having orientation sessions for the panelists, providing a few options for them. And then within each panel, basically the flow is going to be getting some pre-reads. And by the way, the goal is for these sessions to start next week, and to be built on a digital virtual platform, just in order to get all the various stakeholders involved. Now, the first session would be around reviewing the situation assessment needs analysis, being able to move into brainstorming initially, and eventually then being able to filter out the ideas that just wouldn't be viable from the standpoint of either the guiding principles of the Spark Committee or from the allowability guidelines from the federal government around ARPA funds. And then on that viable list of ideas for each panel, prioritizing based on a scoring matrix, and then being able to step back within each panel and say, okay, we understand, the scoring of the ideas, but how do we want to group these together into portfolios? Because there may be some ideas, for instance, that may score lower, but they're enablers for a lot of the high priority ideas. So the goal would be for that to happen in February and March, and near the end of March, for the advisory panel chairs to be able to present those portfolios to the Spark Committee, which all along will be seeing kind of where things are heading. And then for the Spark Committee to be able to, if needed and where needed, go back to the advisory panels through the chairs and ask additional questions or for additional information. And then at the Spark Committee level, being able to work through, okay, what do we want the portfolio to be? The goal would be for the Spark Committee to be seeing more ideas than could be funded. So just as a place, let's say $2 billion worth of ideas, even though obviously there aren't the funds in order to be able to support all those ideas. But that is really meant to help satisfy when I'm saying yes to something. I want to know what I'm saying no to. So they'll be seeing the highest priority ideas and making some trade-offs at that level. With the goal of at the end of April, early May, to be able to have a final set of final portfolio to put forward to the Finance Council. One other thing to note is that the team has been working to create and get online a submission form that will be communicated broadly and accessible to everyone to be able to make submissions online with regards to any idea or opportunity that they want to feed into the process. And so we're even going back and other ideas that have been generated either from listening tours that have been submitted to date, that have come from agencies or certainly the ideas that come from the advisory panel brainstorming itself. Those would all be put in that common format so that apples to apples comparisons could be made. And once again, as idea moved farther down the process, we would add more detail on those ideas as needed. So on slide 6, this is just another way of being able to show that process for each one of the advisory panels. And so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail. And just as a caveat, all the numbers on here are just purely illustrative and just showing that, you know, in terms of there would be a fall off of ideas for efficiency's sake as we move through the process, with the idea that at the start, a lot of ideas are going to be coming into the funnel through various mechanisms, that there'll be a filtering lens to understand which ideas are viable for consideration and further detailing, a prioritization lens to be able to score the ideas against criteria like, you know, the level of impact, duration of impact, feasibility, equity, and then at the end for the each advisory panel to be able to work through how do they want to group those ideas, probably into themes in most cases, in order to be able to present them to the Spark Committee. And once again, the advisory panel chairs know that there are going to be more ideas that go to the Spark Committee than can be funded. But you know, this is the way to make sure that we get those best ideas on the table for the Spark Committee in order for them to make some decisions. So on slide 7, this is an illustration at a very high level of really what will be coming out of the advisory panel process and going to the Spark Committee. And there's one thing that we don't show on here. If you look kind of all the way to the left of the slide, the intent would be to actually identify all the ideas that really didn't even make it into being considered viable ideas. Then for each viable idea, have a summary view of what that idea entailed. In the center, you know, being able to see how they fared in the scoring models and prioritization step, and then being able to see the final recommendations with regards, coming from the advisory panel with regards to the portfolio of investments from their panel for the executive committee, the Spark Committee, to consider. And so finally, this is the last slide on slide 8, and then I'll open it up for any questions or discussion. Where we are right now is we are have been asking for availability of all the advisory panel members and have gotten it and are going to be working with the advisory panel chairs to start locking in some meetings. We are very close to distributing some background materials and pre-reads for the advisory panelists. We have joint orientation sessions, as I mentioned, today and tomorrow for the panel members, just so that they can understand the process. And hopefully today we're also going to be able to get online and begin publicizing that investment idea submission form. So that's all I have kind of prepared to present. Thanks for your time, and open to any questions that you might have.
Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this report. I have two questions. One is on your slide 6, where you're kind of illustrating there's a broad list of ideas that ultimately might get down to 7 or 10 big ideas, I assume, with fairly large dollar amounts attached to each of those ideas. What happens if there's a smaller idea that may be in one of the earlier filtering or prioritizing lenses of the 200 or 100 that may be a less expensive thing to do, so it wouldn't be, say, a 50 or $100 million idea. It might be a $2 or $3 million idea.
Mm-hmm.
Would those still be able to filter into the last filter where you have the 7 to 10 Spark portfolio big idea, objective lens ideas?
They could, and that's a good question. I would imagine that they could be two types of ideas that fall into that category. Ultimately, it would be, the discretion of the advisory panels themselves. But one type was the one I mentioned, which was it might not necessarily be a big ticket idea or even rank as high on its own, but it's an enabler for a lot of other stuff. The second one, which I didn't mention, was it could just be low-hanging fruit, right? It's not expensive. It can have a pretty good impact, and it's fairly easy to do. And so, yeah, I don't think we want to miss those types of ideas.
Right, and I'm not quarreling with the general notion. I just want to make sure if there's some less expensive, but as you say, high impact ideas, that we don't discard those because they don't have a big price tag. Mr. Chairman, I have another question about the individual education learning loss grants, the $50 million that the Spark Committee and the State Finance Council have already approved. Would you like me to wait to ask that question?
No, go ahead while you got it.
Okay, this is on Secretary Burns Wallace's handout in the chart, and there's $50 million, which is direct grants of $1,000 per child to family. So I had a couple of my school districts ask me about that. Do we know the details of how the determination is going to be made as to which families get that up to $1,000? Are school districts going to do that? And if so, when will that money go out, and when will they start making those allocations?
Thank you for the question, sir. So first and foremost, it's not through the school districts. This will go directly out, and so families will be able to directly apply for it. We're finalizing the program design right now, as well as starting the vendor identification process so that we can get this fully stood up. And so the initial kind of sketch of the design, and we can make sure we provide to you in the packets that went through Spark and the State Finance Council, there was kind of like an outline and an overview of how the program could be designed. We'll make sure that comes to this committee to give you a little bit more detail with that. But the idea being that as you open up this for families to apply, you start at lower income brackets, and then you move through as dollars continue to be available, opening up that income bracket until the dollars are fully exhausted. But it will be for families to do a direct application through a portal to be able to access the grants, and then they will have a list of things that the grants can be utilized for, which includes a range of things that could be like physical books or supplies or technology, but it also could be for educational services. And so the design of it, and where we've seen the models where this was kind of modeled around, provides each of those families with that grant to then leverage into kind of their choice of services that are already approved and allowable, so that they know that they can use those in that marketplace to be able to secure them. But we're finalizing that program design like as we speak. So as we have a few more details, I can commit to bringing that back as well.
I'd sure like to see that. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Do we know how we're going to determine by what criteria? Will it be free and reduced lunch determination, or will it be some TANF determination or some other?
If you can allow me to bring that back to you, I know that in the original design, it was kind of a combination, that free and reduced lunch. It also had there was an income break at a certain point, and I don't have that specific details in front of me, but we will get that back to you.
Okay. Appreciate that, and thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions? Senator Petty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question deals with the legislative directives. And so am I to understand that those pieces are there, the amounts of funding, but that has not been obligated?
So the table 3, are you looking at the table 3 group?
I am, yes.
Perfect. So in the table 3, we were going through a process, and then there was kind of more of an administrative process of making sure they were allowable. And the final rule for these dollars just came out at the 1st of January, which allowed us to kind of finally move on a few more things, confirm final allowability. So we actually are in the process of working with the Division of Budget to encumber those dollars and get those moved over. That's why we put them kind of in that chart. We didn't want to say that those had been encumbered and moved. We're in process of doing those, so those will be, and they then will be moved. It's more of we're just at the administrative steps, which is slightly different than table 4, because that one is still under allowability review, as well as there's a potential for some federal labor specific dollars that also might actually qualify better for those. And so we're trying to work through that to figure out which federal dollars actually match onto that number 4. So that one we're still working. The ones in table 3, we've confirmed allowability. We are just doing the administrative steps now to get those encumbered and moved accordingly.
So the ones in table 3 then have all, after researching, they have all been confirmed as being allowable.
That is correct.
Expenditures. Thank you.
Yes.
Other questions? I don't know which one of you this would be for, but either one of you, these investment ideas. What are we talking investment idea? What is that?
So John, do you want to talk a little bit about that work and how you all are envisioning working through the investment ideas and what those might look like in terms of ideas or examples?
Sure. We actually going to have a common submission form. So each one of those ideas needs to be able to have basically a defined thing that it's trying to address in terms of needs, an outline in terms of, what the actions would be and the cost of those actions in order to be able to address those needs, and also be able to identify which panel it would belong to, as well as everything that it would entail. So it's going to be extremely specific once everyone sees what the submission form is. So in some cases, it could be a specific project, but you'd need to understand what the project is tied to. And in other cases, it could be something that could be a little bit more general, at least to start.
So would this be like a business venture or something? I mean, I still don't, I understand your form and I understand you got to submit all this, but I mean, I have an idea of some type of business or investment, or are these the type of things we're looking at, or what?
It could be an investment in a program. A one-time program would probably be one that would be more preferable given the guiding principles. Something more along the lines of that. I'm sure that some proposals that are going to come in are going to be proposals for making investments in facilities in order to be able to kind of achieve an outcome. But, those are going to really need to be able to make it through the allowability process. So it could be a range of things.
Mr. Chair?
Are there any parameters or of
So there
what's-
are, and so the parameters, as someone is applying, we try to help them understand the type of project, the allowability. So looking at the allowability, because there are allowability guidelines. And so there's a whole set of FAQs that will go out as well as additional documents, and kind of like a toolkit helping people understand this is something of what we might be looking for. The other thing that we can provide is back in November, Spark did listening sessions across the state, and we had a large number of responses of individuals coming out, introducing ideas, investment ideas, projects, and things of that initiative. We suspect that much of what we heard through that listening session is now going to formally come in through those submission forms. We have summaries of what was presented in those listening sessions to just give a sample of what we heard in different pockets of the state. And we will make sure that we send those over to you because that might also give a few concrete examples as well.
That'd be very helpful because I mean, it's like, I'm sitting here thinking, well, can the American Legion or the VFW apply for funds to put a new building up or improve the building they're in or things like that? I mean, I'm just trying to think of,
Putting some parameters.
pretty wide open. And I have no idea what you heard.
So we will definitely make sure we pull all of those and share with you all.
And can individual persons qualify for this to, open up a new entrepreneur type business or things like that? I mean, is that kind of stuff acceptable or?
In general, it's
Existing businesses,
right.
we let them come in and say, hey, I'd like to, add on to my building.
In general, it's not, and that's what some of the allowability goes into. There are different things like there being a COVID nexus, the impact that it's going to have, and is it impacting a disproportionate community that was impacted by COVID? And then there are some categories that are actually explicitly unallowable as well. So we will make sure that we pull that information and provide that to you all as well. And what we try to do as individuals start to move through this process, we try to summarize it for that individual that may be applying, where it is easily digestible as they apply through the submission form.
Did I hear 2 billion? Is that what John said? 2 billion with a B? Is that what we were talking? I think early on in the presentation, he said something about 2 billion. Is that correct?
What I said was directionally, the Spark Committee may get 2 billion, and just to throw them $2 billion worth of ideas, they would only move forward with at most, 725 million or so to the Spark, to the Finance Council, because that's all that's available. Or they could decide to go forward with less than that, but it was giving them basically the radar so that they're not just getting something to rubber stamp. They were able to make some trade-offs.
I guess the other question I would have is, in particularly the restaurant industry. I mean, I can drive from here to Goodland, which is 370 miles, and they're closed. I mean, do these kind of things qualify for any of this? I mean, it's pretty sad that the way that industry's been hurt. When they shut down, they just never open back up.
So one of the things, and John, I welcome your input here. So for instance, kind of similar that happened during that first round of CARES, an investment idea could be specifically for, say, the hospitality industry, targeting on, those that were impacted specifically, then allowing them to be able to tap into grants for allowable things for their recovery. So that could be an investment deal at that kind of higher level, as John talked about in that big picture, but it could be something that also comes forward that's smaller as an individual submission. That's what part, I believe, the advisory panels can maybe working to do, is to kind of bring all the good ideas together and figure out how do we put together a good slate that really addresses needs in various ways, to then give the executive committee of Spark kind of a range of things and an understanding that it's not just a laundry list of things, but this is also addressing identified needs in communities that have manifested. And that's why through the submission form, we're actually asking people to specifically address it. What was the impact? What does that look like? How will this help that fulfill that need or that gap? John, I don't know if you want to add there.
No, I think that explains it well. And I apologize earlier if I wasn't as specific as you may have wanted, but with that idea of that funnel, what we're trying to do is encourage people, if they have ideas, to submit them. But once they get into that form and start understanding better the allowability constraints, as well as the guiding principles of the Spark Committee, it may cause them to realize that it may not fit here. At the same time, we're making it open to everyone.
Maybe you could send us a copy of the application form too. That might be helpful.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I love being on Ways and Means because we get to deal with money and figures. I knew I would get to use my junior high math teaching someday in the future, and today's the day. On your charts, and I don't know which one to address this to, on table 1 through, is it 4? Are all of those approved by State Finance Council? Are those are expenditures that are in the pipeline?
So what I would say is in chart 1,
Right.
all of those are approved by State Finance Council. Okay, and have been expended, moved, encumbered, and are being utilized. Chart 2 doesn't go through State Finance Council because you all legislated it. Those were legislative directives in the last bill, right? So those don't go through, those are, in the bills it said, the director of budget shall, if federal funds are available, use those federal funds first. So the items in chart 2 fall under that legislative directive, so they didn't go through State Finance Council. Make sure I'm looking through these correct. Same with table 3. Those also are legislative directive, didn't go through State Finance Council. Chart 2, table 2, those are all done, have moved or encumbered, except that second UI trust fund, because that's not triggered off until this summer. And then in table 3, those are the ones that I mentioned earlier that we're in the process of moving over. But again, those are legislative directives. And then that last item in table 4 is also a legislative directive. So table 1, State Finance Council approved. All the other tables are because of legislative directives. Does that help?
Yes, okay, and now let me practice my math, and you may need to correct me. So we had $1.6 billion total available, roughly, is that?
And the discretionary funds, correct.
And particularly initially, the legislature essentially took out $500 million for the UI unemployment. And as you said, 250 is committed, the other 250 we're waiting to see if we need that. And so as I add up those 4 tables, I get roughly $378 million, or $79 million, ballparky, out of the 1.2, assuming we're taking out the 500 million. So we have about $820 million available to spend. I heard John say maybe 720 some.
So look at, and I apologize because the page is split a little bit. At the top of 1, there you see the 1.6.
Right.
And if you follow table 1 all the way down, it shows the total that's allocated by Spark is the 261. You see that at the very bottom?
Right.
Then as you move to table 2, at the very bottom, it says the 592. That's that table's total. The third table is the 15. If you add those all up, it doesn't have a total on here, but when you subtract those three tables, you'll see at the top of your last page, the unallocated amount of the discretionary dollars that are still left is at 731. And I apologize, it's because of the breaking of the pages that it might have gotten lost up there. So that's the number that we're starting with. Now, there's some things in there, understanding that, for instance, as an example, with every stage of these various, even in the Spark allocations, most of those were in up to approval. So given once the programs are done, if there's additional dollars there and they don't spend the amount that was up to, those would then recouped and go back into the bigger pot. It's very similar to what we did under CRF. When something was done, let's say there was still another $1 million or $2 million that hadn't been utilized, but the program was complete and the goals were met, we recouped those dollars and then reallocated it back to the big pool. So all throughout this process, that dollar amount, sometimes we hesitate to put a hard dollar amount because it sticks, that there is still flux in there, because as each of these programs move their way through and or wrap up, some of that may change because dollars may be flowing in or out. But in general, that's the dollar amount that, as we kick off the advisory councils, that's the figure that we're working with as that available in the discretionary funds. One of the things that, and John can speak to this a little bit, one of the things that is going to happen in the advisory council as they are having these conversations, we've talked a lot about the investments and allowability, but we will also be helping in the advisory councils them to understand what are other funding that may be available. So as you were saying, there might be an amazing project that comes through and everyone's like, that should be done. And it may or may not be allowable under these discretionary dollars, but there may be other federal or other dollars that it actually is better to match onto, either to match with the state or it just lines up better. So for instance, there is the infrastructure bill that was passed, which is not a recovery bill and not necessarily under this purview or this conversation. But if something comes forward and it squarely fits over there, we're going to help those advisory committees understand that there are, or there may be additional pots of money, or this project might be more appropriate to be funded this way. Because what we're trying to do is maximize the discretionary dollars, because you always want to use these dollars in a way that if there's other funding sources, you want to tap those first and use your discretionary dollars to be the most flexible. So that's also a dynamic of what's going to happen in those advisory groups. They're not just going to be looking at the list. We're also helping them understand what other funding. Remember that all of our counties, a number of our cities, and some of our smaller entities are non-entitlement units also all receive discretionary dollars as well. So there might be an initiative that comes forward that would make sense for there to be a state and local partnership of our discretionary dollars to move that project forward. So we also hope in those advisory committees that conversations like that will happen, that it's not just, oh, we dump everything here, but we really are having a strategic conversation on how best to leverage these dollars and make them go as far as we can with deep one-time impact.
I certainly like us having an opportunity to be strategic, and so and you did mention the infrastructure bill, which may give us, like, and I'm thinking I'm on transportation, there may be some transportation things that might fit in here or might better fit. And so if I look at my numbers, we roughly have $731 million to think about, but depending on what happens in Department of Labor and the UI Trust Fund, we might have up to almost $980 million that we could look at in the Spark process. And depending on whether some of these things, for example, the docking building, whether some of that money could be available also. So I think we have a lot of strategic opportunities here, and I very much appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Just one final comment. I see this 24/7 pay plan, and I've seen on several pieces of material, temporary pay raise. I think that's something you need to kind of look at. I don't know how you give anyone a temporary pay raise. I can't see you giving somebody a raise and saying, in 6 months, if we hire enough folks, we get back to closer to fully staffed, that goes away. They're going to be walking on you, leaving their jobs. I think we're going to make this even worse when you start talking about temporary pay raises. That's going to be a real problem. That's as bad as staffing our hospitals with traveling nurse and docs and whatever it is. That's going to cause a humongous problem. So take that in consideration. Thank you. Committee, next we'll have update on CAPERS with Alan Conroy, Executive Director of CAPERS. Welcome, committee, Alan.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Certainly pleased to be here today and try to be responsive to any questions that you may have. Some of you may have had the opportunity to hear parts of this, and so I'll move through it at a pretty good clip, but certainly be respectful. If there's questions or we need to expand on any of the information, please let me know. Just on page 2, it's just that reminder. There's those 3 retirement plans within CAPERS, regular CAPERS, state, school, local, police and fire, and judges. There's over 1,500 employers that are affiliated with CAPERS, so the state, all the school districts, all the counties, a great deal of the cities. City of Wichita is probably the largest exception. They're big enough to have their own retirement system. But then you get into community colleges and conservation districts and fire service protection districts and public libraries and so forth. CAPERS is governed by a 9-member board of trustees, 4 appointed by the governor, 2 elected by the members, 1 appointed by the president of the Senate, and Sam Williams is the current appointee by President Masterson. Our newest trustee is Trustee Jo Yoon from Prairie Village, and she was appointed by the governor. And then back to the makeup of the board, 2 are elected by the membership, 1 on the school side, 1 on the new non-school side, and then the state treasurer, by virtue of the office, is also a trustee. On page 4, just outlines the topics that the chair had asked us to address today. Just how we doing on investment returns, very good news there. Pension funding bonds, more very good news there. That the Board of Trustees is looking at the investment return assumption. And then the 2 new topics that have, I guess, sort of come to the forefront since the session began, the governor's recommendation on moving CAPERS Correctional to police and fire, and then the general discussion, including the governor's specific recommendation on additional funding for CAPERS. Slide 5 just reminds you, and of course, if there's one number to remember today as you leave this room, it'd be 26.3. And that's in the most recent fiscal year. The CAPERS Trust Fund had a positive return of 26.3. Now, of course, I wish we could have that every year, but unfortunately, of course, it won't be that way. And even if you just look at the stock market here the last few days, we're not in, there haven't been positive action in the stock market. But again, CAPERS, the trust fund, is a long-term, long-horizon investor, large institutional investor. So those ups and downs certainly will come into play. And just remind you, over half of the money to the trust fund comes from that investment side, about 1/3 from the employers, and the balance from members. On the returns, the lower right there on page 5 just shows you that 26.3 and then different time periods. But if you look back, the last 25-year periods, and this was through November, the most recent at the time, still trying to close out December year-end information, but we're right at 8%. And so we've had a good run over those last 25 years. And as you look on slide 6, these are fiscal year returns. You can see that up and down, that 26.3, the 22.6%, the big downturn in 2008 and 2009, the downturn in 2001 and 2002. So ups and downs, but over 25 years, a positive 8%. And that dashed line across the table is that the current actuarially assumed rate of 7.75%. Slide 7 then just looks at, just looks at those time periods. And of course, it depends on what time period you're measuring, how the percentages come out. But the latest one returned, this was through the end of December, 16.6%. The last 25 years in this calculation, it's 7.9%. Slightly below 8, but still above the assumed 7.5. And as we close out the December books, we're waiting on some of the alternative investment people. I believe will be above 16% return for the most recent calendar year. The chair had also asked that we address how things have been going on pension funding bonds. As you may remember, last session, the legislature authorized $500 million in additional pension funding bonds. The 30-year bonds sold in August of last year, and they sold for a rate of 2.65%, which of course is a good, very positive rate. And so that's just, so that's the marker. Over the next 30 years, can the trust fund earn more than 2.65%? And I certainly hope we can, or there'll probably be lots of other problems we're dealing with on that front. Money came in August. It was invested across the KPERS portfolio, lowered the unfunded actuarial liability by $500 million on that day. The estimated improvement, the funded ratio, and that's assets to liabilities. You want to be at 100%. That state school funded ratio was increased by 2.3%. And the annual debt service on the bonds, presumably from the State General Fund, to be about $24 million. And you may remember, some of you may know, there have been 2 other instances where the state has issued pension funding bonds to help improve the funded status of the trust fund. In 2004, there was bonds issued there. The net to KPERS was $440 million. The interest rate at that time was 5.39%. That debt service that the state pays, is about $33 million a year, and that comes from the Expanded Lottery Act Revenues Fund proceeds, or the casino money. In 2015, the state issued $1 billion with a B, and it sold, the interest rate there is 4.699%. The annual debt service on that $1 billion bond, $65 million coming out of the State General Fund. On slide 10, as you look, so what's the experience been? And of course, there's certainly, again, that reminder, they're 30-year bonds, but since 2004, we've taken the money, invested it, the state's paid the debt service. So what's the net position collectively of the state, including KPERS, for those bond issuance? So we've earned a little over 8% on that money, and you all have paid the debt service. And after paying the debt service on that money, we've earned then $624 million. So give us $440 million, 2004, you pay the debt service, subtract that out, we're still to the good $624 million. You look at 2015, of course, way shorter time period, so about 6 years. But again, same kind of methodology there. You all are paying the debt service. You factor that out on the investments. We're still to the good $436 million. So 9.5% we've been able to earn on those bonds. And so on slide 11, then, just reminded you, though, of course, these are 30-year bonds, and so that's where we are as of November. Things certainly could change in the future, and of course, the most recent bonds, of course, selling in August. We'll see how that 30-year journey goes to see how we've done. But between the 2 bonds, then, to think after the state pays the debt service, but after that, there's been a net positive of $1 billion to the trust fund. So again, 30-year bonds, but so far, I think it's safe to say that they've worked as anticipated, as hoped. So certainly good news there. On slide 12 then just starts the third topic in terms of that investment return assumption. Annually, of course, we get an actuarial evaluation which measures those assets and liabilities. Then the actuary takes that to estimate benefit costs and to help the Keepers Board establish those employer contributions. And there's, of course, lots and lots of actuarial assumptions that go into that, but probably one of the most important is what's that actuarial assumed rate of return? What's the assumption out of the trust fund? What will be the earnings off of that trust fund? And the previous slide, as you saw, at least to that point, over half of the money as receipts to the trust fund comes from that investment earning. And it's important to get that actuarial assumed rate of return correct because, of course, a lower investment return means there'll be less money coming in off those investments in the future, which then increases the present value of future benefits, the liabilities, and of course, who makes that up? It's you all. The employer is the plug factor because employees put in their part, investments are whatever investments are, and then to make it balance, then it's reflected in that employer contribution rate. And of course, as you all know, the state pays that employer contribution rate not only for all state employees, but all school employees as part of state aid to local school districts. In terms of setting that rate, it's a delegated authority. The legislature sent it over to the Board of Trustees in 1998. Again, as mentioned, that current rate's 7.75%, and that's working with our consulting actuary and our general investment consultant. They've looked at it several different times. Back in 2016, it had been at 8%. They revised it down to 7.75%. So in 2016, and prior to that, it had been 8% since 1986. And so, but it's important to try to get it as close to accurate as possible or best informed guess, because if that investment return is too high, then that pushes costs then to future generations and vice versa. If it's too low, it sends it the other way. And it's called that intergenerational equity to try to make sure that the current employers are paying the appropriate amount based on all the best information. And it's not being either, they're not overpaying or they're not underpaying. On slide 14 then, again, the board last looked at it in 2019. At that time, the investment consultant, their 10-year return, and of course on the trust fund, they have a much longer investment horizon, but it was 7.1%. Since then, that our investment consultant has lowered their 10-year expected return to 6%. Of course, lots of pension plans across the country are reviewing that. Keepers is certainly probably in the higher tier of plans at 7.75%. Most are in that 7.25%, 7%. Some have even gone below 7%. The board just met, has been reviewing it, gathering information, working with the actuary and our investment consultant. They just spent time at their January meeting talking about it, and they'll continue that discussion at their March meeting. Slide 15 switches gears then to the topic sort of since the session has started. The governor, as you may be aware, in her budget recommendation, did recommend that Capers correctional members and wildlife and park law enforcement officers be eligible for police and fire coverage. Currently, wildlife and park law enforcement officers are in Capers. They're new. If they hire somebody as a law enforcement officer in wildlife and parks, they're in Capers 3. Those correctional officers are in that Capers correctional group, which has some similarities to the Capers 2 group. And there's kind of there's a Capers correctional group subgroup within Capers 2. There's the first group is correctional officers, and then the other group are correctional staff that have direct and continuous contact with inmates. So it might be food service and those types of positions. As you can see in the bottom of 15, currently CAPERS 2 members, their normal retirement is age 60 with 30 years, age 65 with 5 years, which is the same as CAPERS 3. But in CAPERS Correctional, for the correctional officers group, it's age 55 with 10 years, or for the correctional B group, it's age 60 with 10 years of service. And then there's some provisions for some early retirement. Slide 16 just kind of recaps kind of the differences, kind of lays them side by side. Vesting in CAPERS Correctional is 5 years, KPNF it's 15, higher employee contribution 6% versus 7.5%, certainly a higher employer contribution in that 14-15% range to about 23% under police and fire. Of course, CAPERS correctional officers are in Social Security, and it's currently in police and fire, it's kind of a mixed bag. For example, highway patrol troopers, KBI agents are not a part of Social Security. Back in the early 60s and 70s, when those decisions were being made, the state elected to not provide Social Security coverage for those groups. So they're not, so as you look at employer contributions, there might be additional contributions for Social Security coverage as well. They both have, the traditional defined benefit plan, finalist average salary, years of service, and then a multiplier. CAPERS Correctional is 185, KPNF it's at 2.5%. There is no cap on the CAPERS Correctional side, so as long as you work, that formula continues to work. But a 30-year service would generate a benefit of a little over 55%. KPNF, it is capped at 90% of final average salary, which it mathematically works out to 36 years of service. And again, you can just see for KPNF, normal retirement, age 50 at 25 years, age 55 with 20 years, or age 60 with 15 years of service. On slide 17 then, just, should that move take place and those employee contributions would go up, it's about $500 a year for that additional 1.15% on a $40,000 a year salary. On the employer side, going from that 13 to about 23%, it's about $4,000 on a $40,000 salary example. Of course, longer vesting, but certainly a stronger multiplier, that 2.5% police and fire. And the disability benefits are less, I guess, a little less strict in the police and fire system as opposed to regular CAPERS. So on slide 18, just in terms of implications of changing coverage, just that when a member moves from CAPERS to KPNF, their CAPERS service doesn't convert to police and fire. So ultimately, when they retire, if they had, let's say 8 years of service in CAPERS and the balance in police and fire, they ultimately really get about, it's the equivalent of 2 retirement checks, one on that 8 years of regular CAPERS, and then if they worked, let's say 20 years under KPNF, then they get a benefit based on that years of service. Do note just how it works, at least under current law. So under CAPERS, if they're vested 5 years, they're vested at 5 years, so they'd have that. But then if they switch over to police and fire and only work, let's say, another 5 years and they pay into police and fire, that would not make them vested in police and fire. So when they left state service or retired, let's say they left at that point, they would only get a retirement benefit for those 5 years of CAPERS service and then a refund of contributions on the KPNF, because they wouldn't have made it to that vesting period for 15 years at KPNF.
I think we'll wait till we're done before we ask questions.
And I'm just about there. Just in terms of the cost projections on slide 19 then, it has been considered off and on, and of course different groups have have advanced the idea of moving from regular capers into police and fire. The estimated cost last session, and it's of course based on payroll, there was a bill, and so we worked with our actuary. It would increase state contributions annually of about $6 million to make that change for the Capers Correctional one. So it's about $6 million. And so we're currently working with our actuary and, of course, the governor's budget division and the Department of Corrections, Wildlife and Parks to get their current payrolls, and all that goes into those calculations. But I assume it'll be something close to that $6 million figure. And then the last item that the chair had asked for, the governor, of course, had recommended that about $254 million in our budget then used to pay off the remaining amount of some delayed employer contributions from 2017 and 2019. These are layering payments, I think is the term that sort of took on. There were $64 million in 2017, $194 million in 2019 that weren't able to be paid because of budget constraints at the time. And so the legislature decided they still wanted to make those commitments, but to pay them over on a level dollar basis over the next 20 years. So on the $64 million, paying $6.4 million. On the $194 million, it's $19.4 million a year for the 20 years. Our actuary, the note there and kind of the bold there, kind of the middle of slide 20. So our actuary, since the law says the legislature is going to pay it to us, and that's the law, of course, then the actuary has already factored that money into the actuarial calculations. So if we get this sort of prepayment on these layering payments, of course, it's a positive thing. The money's in the trust fund. We can now invest it, and that's good. And once it's in the trust fund, it's gonna stay there unless it goes to pay benefits. And so that's certainly a positive thing, but it's not going to move that actuarial needle because the actuary's already factored in those layering payments that they're coming, and so, but it's still cash to the trust fund, still cash we'll be able to invest. And so on slide 21, it just shows you that how it started out, the layering payments, what's remaining. There's 15 years on one, 17 years on the other, so about $425 million if you stay on the payment plan. If you want to prepay, it's that $254 million there in that lower box, $60 million on one, $994 million on the other, and there's some timing on when those payments started. So if you're able to prepay in terms of what will save the budget going forward, then it's $172 million. Those roughly $25 million annual payment that won't have to be made in the future and saves you $172 million. I'm sorry, then the last item just wanted to mention was the other topic that's sort of risen to in conjunction with that is the additional payments to capers to pay down some debt given the current status of the state budget. And so it would, of course, improve the funded status of the system, reduce future employer contributions, and I guess depending on when you want that good impact to take place, there's just some discussion there. If you want it in fiscal year 23 or if it's fiscal year 24, our actuary presents her report in July of 2022, and so it's kind of a timing thing there. But on slide 23 then, and some of you, of course, may have heard some of these, there's been discussions about a $450 million or $500 million or $575 million or $1 billion. And it's not perfectly sort of linear in terms of those additional amounts, but whatever the amount is, it's going to decrease that unfunded actuarial liability by approximately the same amount. So if it's $500 million, it's generally going to reduce the unfunded actuarial liability by that. For each $100 million you might send over to the trust fund, it's going to improve that funded ratio by about 0.4%, and will decrease the annual employer contributions. We're talking state school here, about $7.5 million per 100 million. And so just this week, the House, there was a bill introduced in the House for $1 billion. Had two parts to it. One was to pay off those layering payments, and then the balance would be additional contributions of about $746 million, which gets you then to that $1 billion. And then the last slide, slide 24, just shows you, so if you send over $1 billion, it decreases that unfunded actuarial liability by $1 billion. So it'd go from about $5 billion down to $4 billion. This is state school again. It would improve that funded ratio of 4.2 by 4.2%, so get you over 80%. Again, funded ratios, assets to liabilities. I mean, you want to be on your way to 100%, but kind of the last big hurdle on that is getting over 80%. So again, you want the stronger the funded ratio, whenever that next big downturn in the market comes, you can weather that downturn and allow the trust fund to work its way back. And then the savings on the employer contributions, that $1 billion in this example would save you about $75 million, all funds in the state school contributions. So over 5 years, it would reduce employer contributions by about $400 million. So certainly it'd be a positive thing in terms of this funded status of the trust fund. So, Mr. Chair, hopefully covered those things: the investment returns, pension funding bonds, investment return assumption, police and fire for correctional and wildlife and parks, and then the additional money for capers, but certainly be pleased to respond to any questions as appropriate.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate you being here today. We'll take questions. So, Senator Petty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alan, I wish I understood it as well as you explain it, but back on slide 18, for clarification, this was dealing with the moving some CAPER employees to KPNF. So if there's a CAPER employees currently with wildlife and parks, and they haven't been there 5 years, and this does occur that they're moved over to KPNF, do they have to be vested that? Do they have to have that 5 years in order to have been?
No, they do not in that case.
In that scenario, not. Right. But once they're then moved over to KPNF, they have to be 15 years.
That's right.
Okay.
Otherwise, and that's right. That has been a point of discussion in the past because, some of those, whether or not they're going to get to that 15 years to trigger that KPNF benefit.
Thank you.
Senator Fagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Alan, thank you for your presentation. On page 20, you was talking about the delayed contributions are being paid with interest over 20 years, and then kind of how much it saves. Is that a fixed or a variable interest?
It's fixed, so it's at 775.
For 20 years, it's 775 no matter what you do.
That's right.
All right. Second thing I wanted to ask is on page 9, when you talked about the money coming out of the lottery in 2004.
Yes.
A little history, and I don't know if you know that. Why did they ever ear tag that to the lottery?
Good question. I think they were, and not to maybe speak for them, but I think they were looking for a dedicated funding source at the time, and maybe it gave some buoyancy maybe to the whole expanded Lottery Act Revenues Fund when all that was going on. So what was the money going to be used for if casinos were authorized? And so this was, I guess, one maybe noble purpose to use the money for.
So why I asked that, times change, you ear tag, you don't know what tomorrow holds. I personally hate to ear tag things like that, to keep it simple, because there are different things that can happen there. So I was wondering if there's any history to that.
Yeah, I think it was kind of the sale of the package at the time. And I think it does kind of raise the point that So, and we talk about employer contributions, and all that is, you know, in state school, it's about 700 million a year that's coming over, but that does not include the debt service on these bonds, which is in the Department of Administration. So you have these bond payments of 33 million, you have bond payments of 65 million, now you have bond payments of 24 million for the most recent one. So that's $122 million of annual debt service the state's paying for the support, you know, the support of capers. And so that's, as you factor in all these numbers, that's certainly it's part of that commitment the state made to sort of right the funding position of capers, you know, through increased employer contributions, creation of capers 3, and then the additional bonds.
Thank you.
Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alan, thank you for your work and your staff and your board, and incredible success. I want to be clear about one thing. The governor has recommended paying off those layered payments, and that's in here. And then you mentioned the House bill that would borrow essentially $1 billion, or would, well, I'm sorry, not borrow, but make $1 billion payment, which would be both the layering and additional. What's the difference between the SGF funding saving, or SGF savings on those two proposals? It seems to me the layering gives us full 100%, but the other doesn't give us full 100%. Is that right?
That'd be correct. On the part on the state school employer contribution, it's not all general fund, particularly for the state agencies that might, you know, have fee funds or federal funds that are paying, you know, their employer contributions for their staff, you know, and so it's coming from a source to pay those personnel costs other than the general fund. But if I remember correctly, but school's such a big part of it, and that's all general fund. Probably about 85% of the savings would be general fund savings, and the balance would be other funds, federal funds, fee funds. The budget director's probably more attuned to this than I am, but that was the last I think I have, was about 85% of that money that would be saved for the roughly 750 million on those employer contributions would be state general fund savings.
So just doing the layering payment gives us 100%, which I like that. I had another question, Mr. Chairman, on the financing.
Go ahead.
On page 9, and I should know this, but this gets complicated, so I probably asked it before over the last 8 or 9 years, but on the bonds that we have, why don't we, if we could get that 2.65% on the 500 million that we agreed to last year, which is great, kudos. That was great on our part. We were really smart doing that, Mr. Chairman, and Capers did a wonderful job, and was it Kansas Development Finance Authority
played a big part.
They did a great job. That was a huge win for the people of Kansas and for our state employees that use Capers. But why can't we, if we could get that kind of rate, why wouldn't we refinance the 500 million and the $1 billion?
There isn't really refunding position or language that permits that in these bond issuances, or if there is, it's called hold harmless. So you're still going to have to pay whatever you're going to have to pay. So the bondholders can count on the money, the current revenue stream, what they were going to get over the life of the bonds. They're going to get that whether or not you continue to pay it over the 30 years or if you sort of buy them out. But I guess there's no savings, no economic savings in terms of refinancing.
So if I'm here 10 years from now and we decide to do another $1 billion bond, is there a way to structure those so you have the ability to pay them off if you get lower rates?
Yes, I mean, generally there is, but of course then you usually probably, as you go to sell the bonds, then there's a premium you pay because then they know at some point they might be paid off, and in terms of their revenue stream calculations, maybe that's not, not what they're hoping for or planning for. So yes, it could be structured. Usually there's kind of a downside, or you pay a premium for it.
Well, as an aside, I noticed in our joint budget committee when we had a presentation from KDFA about what we might be able to buy down in terms of state debt, and they looked at all of the different bonds we had out there. There were only a few where it made dollar cents. So
Yeah, that's correct.
you've clarified this is the same game.
Yep,
and
exactly.
the same dilemma, that you can't just go out like you refinance your house and say, oh, great, interest rates went down, I'm going to refinance and go to the bowl game or the Super Bowl. Not going to happen. So thank you.
Other
Thank you,
questions? Seeing none. Alan, thank you a lot. One question I guess that I would have is you showed the increments on the up to $1 billion from 500. Was it like 600 to 700 where we do hit the 80% in case we didn't get the whole billion?
Yes, that's right. Probably about 575 million would get you to the 80%.
Thank you, and thanks for being here today. One more question from Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You raised a question I had and I forgot to ask. And maybe the public would want, if we get to 80%, that's sort of the magic place. And you don't, while it might be nice to be over 80%, you're really in a sweet spot on any retirement system if you're 80% funded on unfunded liability. And why is that?
I think again, and it's a hurdle to be over, but the goal is still get to 100%. And there are state pension plans that are at 100% funded. And you just want that number as high as you can. So when you look back like in 2010 and 11 and 2001 and 2002, when that big downturn in the market comes, and we know it will, the trust fund, we took about a 20% hit in the value of the trust fund in those big downturns. And so if that funded ratio is too low, then so then all of a sudden the assets go down 20%. So now that pulls it down dramatically. And in fact, in 2012, after the 2011 downturn, that's when the funded ratio hit its lowest point. We were at 56%. And at some point, if it gets too low, if you hit one, but then should there be another big downturn, a couple years later, then it just makes it very difficult to invest your way out of that that weak spot over time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you again, Alan. Appreciate it. Committee, I would remind everyone that Senator McGinn had to leave early. She had a commitment, but it is her birthday today, so be sure and wish her a happy birthday. With that, we are adjourned.